Well, good morning. So I wanted to look at this idea today of our stories. Oh yeah, we all have some. Yeah, have you ever noticed how you could take two or more people and put them in the exact same situation, and yet they might each one have a totally different reaction? Ever notice that? Well, why? Hello, why? Because each one has a different perception, a different belief, a story that they're telling themselves about that situation, about what it means or represents to them. And I remember a few years back accompanying my niece and nephew to Disneyland, and we got on Space Mountain. And I remember there was a couple behind us, a man and a woman, and she was just all chatty about how excited she was about it. She's getting on with him and introducing him to this ride. And as we were getting closer and closer to the ride, and you could hear people screaming, and everything, he was getting more and more quiet. We got on the ride, and through it, I heard her just absolutely screaming and laughing and everything. And when it came to a halt afterwards, as we're getting out of our little spaceships, I heard her saying to him, "Oh, honey, that was just so much fun." All of a sudden, as I looked back, he went from being very pale and stoic to suddenly the color coming back as he said to her, "How could you take me on a ride like that? I hate those. You just did this to humiliate me." And she's just looking shocked. Same situation, two very different reactions. "Oh, this is so wonderful. This is horrible, and she's doing this on purpose," right? What was different? The story they were each telling themselves about the experience. So speaking of stories, there's one that I keep hearing resurface, and the character descriptions change, but the situation is basically the same. And so this time we'll say it's about a Catholic priest, a Lutheran minister, and a religious science minister that all find themselves stranded on a desert island. And they're there for years, and they manage to survive. And one day, they're walking along the beach, and they discover one of those old-fashioned genie lamps. And they say, could it be? So they all get together, and they start rubbing the lamp. And sure enough, a genie pops out, and he's just like, "You have freed me from my thousands of years of captivity." He looks and goes, "Oh, normally I can grant one person 3 wishes, but there are 3 of you, so I guess I can grant each of you 1 wish. So think carefully about what you want." And so they contemplate it for a while, and the Catholic priest goes first. He goes, "Okay, you know what? I get that this is God's message to me, that I have led a life of abstinence, and I don't need to do that anymore. I've always wanted to have a place on Park Avenue, a penthouse, and live lavishly, and I want to have enough money to attend every single show, every play. I want all the most beautiful models to just want to have no strings attached relationships with me. I just want to live life to the fullest and never run out of money." Genie says, "Done." Off he goes. Lutheran minister goes next. He goes, "Well, like my brother, I also feel this is God telling me I don't need to lead such, a simple life anymore." Now, unlike him, I got to have my time with women and all of that before I went into the ministry, but I am so in love with my wife. I would like us to be reunited. And you know what? We're more the Hollywood scene kind of people. So I want us to have a mansion in Bel Air, and we'll have every Hollywood director and producer and star as our friends, and every night we'll throw a big party, and it'll be so exciting. And again, I don't want to ever run out of money, so we can travel, we can do whatever we want till the end of our days. Again, the genie says, "Done." Off they go. Off he goes with his wife. The religious science minister thinks about it for a while, and he says, our philosophy is about seeing the good in every moment. So I really feel like God has been with me every step of the way here. I don't need anything else. So, but we're also about being open to the ever-expansive good. So, well, it was really helpful for me to have other people with me here on the island to explore these beliefs, to go deeper and deeper. He said, I think that's what I want to do. So the only thing that might be better is if I could have my two friends back here with me. Anyone want to bet that there were two versions of this story of being reunited that might be a bit different from the third? So, in Science of Mind, in our teaching, we really emphasize how our perceptions about ourselves and the world, the way we see ourselves, the story we tell ourselves about ourselves and the world out there, absolutely have a direct bearing on how we experience life. That the more we come from a place of sensing that innate goodness of God in ourselves, no matter what, that innate essence of God's nature in everything and everyone, the more open we are to calling it forth into expression, the more we get to experience that goodness in our lives. But I don't know if you've noticed, I've paid attention to some of my stories. I don't think our stories always reflect that truth, do they? Hello? I think the ones that we carry both consciously and subconsciously don't necessarily reflect a sense of our oneness with God. But if we think about it, every experience in our lives, in and of itself, is neutral. How we perceive that experience, the story we tell about it, is what counts. We have this saying in our teaching, change your thinking, change your life. One of our practitioners, B. Elliott, published a book taking that idea, saying, change your story, change your life. Because in every experience, whether we initially label it as good or bad or indifferent, every moment, because God is always there, gives us an opportunity to experience some essence of God's nature. In those experiences that we would say are good, if we realize that that's God's infinite nature of goodness that's always available to us, coming forth in this moment as this experience, we can enjoy it, but also not cling to it, because we know there's ever more good to be realized when it's time to release this one. And in the bad, in those experiences that we don't necessarily see right away as positive, if we know that there's some aspect of God's nature that's being called forth for us to know and realize and experience more fully, then we'll be able to make good of the situation. But often, don't we see it a little bit differently? The good that we see, we tend to see as something that, oh my God, if I ever lose this, I'll be unhappy. And so we cling to it. And the negative situations that come up, we just feel so victimized by, we feel resented, we feel wounded. And that doesn't necessarily serve us, does it? So I love this visual that my beloved, I call her my co-joined ministerial twin, Reverend Bonnie Rose, who used to be here at North Hollywood. We went through ministerial school pretty much joined at the hip. So she and I were talking, and she came up with this idea that I really enjoy about, if you look at this box here, in this box, there's an object. So let's say that the object represents an event, something that happens, that comes our way, something we experience, we learn about, we witness. And then around that, there's a reaction that becomes an experience, right? There's a reaction based on our ways of seeing things at the time. So now the experience becomes whatever. So that's the box. And then we start telling ourselves stories about that experience and what it represents to us. So good so far. The important part here is these strings on the outside of the box. Those represent how much do we cling to those stories. How strongly do we want to hold on to those beliefs and those ideas that we've been carrying around that experience? See, the experience itself could be good or bad. So when the story reflects some idea of God's nature being present in that experience, in the good, that was God's goodness coming my way in this form, or like we can make good of it because God's nature is still there in what we've experienced, that's great. You know, in the challenges, when we say, you know, this is my opportunity to learn more about faith, about abundance, about forgiveness, about that love in me that is so expansive and not relying on others to validate me. When we can do that, then certainly we keep moving in a positive direction. It's the ones about where we're losers, where we'll never amount to anything, where we feel so wounded we'll never overcome this hurt that we've experienced. Those are the ones that we might want to question. And have you noticed that when those stories are negative, whether we're doing a lot of self-deprecation against ourselves or condemnation of others, that rather than being told in, let's say, a somewhat objective journalistic style, you know, like our more reputable newspapers at least try to be objective as they tell stories, ours really take on a National Enquirer-esque quality about them, right? Life never goes my way. I'm a failure. I'll never try something again. That's so humiliating. Or I'll never trust people like that, claims Reverend Mark, right? Those are the ones that as we discover that they're playing out in that way in our consciousness, we might want to take a look and maybe start to cut the strings that we've been holding around them. Maybe get rid of the story. Do you like these visual aids, folks? And remember, what started off the whole experience was just a situation that came our way, right? Sorry, I'm having to. There we go. It was just a situation like this simple black rock. But you see, this was given to me by a client of mine who loved how in our philosophy we say, in everything that even seems ordinary or even in the negative, there's some great gem of God's nature to be revealed. There's always something of God's nature for us to discover in every situation. As we go back and revisit that and see what aspect of God's nature that gave us a chance to learn about, to incorporate more fully, we can rewrite our story. So a story that I was always fascinated with as a child, being a little Catholic boy who went to Catholic school. I don't know if you were in my generation, you probably at one point got movie day where they showed the Song of Bernadette, the story of the Saint Bernadette Soubirous in France. If you do not know the story, she's the one who saw the apparitions of the lady that she called, who they decided was the Virgin Mary. And, well, it had particular significance to me because my cousins that I'm closest to in France actually live in the town of Nevers, which is right in the center of France, which is where in the later part of her life, Bernadette got to be a nun and serve in the convent. And one of the miracles when they exhumed her body is that it was incorrupt, and you can see her body in the convent in a glass coffin. So I used to go as a child and pray and be fascinated. But here's the thing about the story that always fascinated me. So Bernadette saw the apparition, and the woman told her to go dig in this area and to drink from the water. There was no water, but later a spring sprang forth, and that became the healing waters of Lourdes that you've probably heard of, that many people go to for miraculous healings. Bernadette herself was very sickly from childhood. She was always drawn to the spiritual life. She always wanted to take catechism classes because she came from such a poor family and her health was so poor, she often couldn't be in school, and they labeled her as very simple, and so they didn't let her take the catechism classes, and she was so unhappy about that. After all these apparitions, later in life, she was allowed to pursue this spiritual life and become a nun and serve at the convent in Nevers. And although many, many people had these accounts of miraculous physical healings, Bernadette never experienced a healing. She died at age 35 from tuberculosis. In the last years of her life, she developed a tumor on her knee that apparently caused excruciating pain. And she wasn't treated particularly nicely by the Mother Superior. Some of the nuns were jealous of her, why this simple girl had had these apparitions. One of the things she was told by the apparition was, "I cannot promise to make you happy in this life, but in the next." Now, I was really bothered by that, even as a child. I thought, wait a minute, God doesn't want us to be happy in this life? We have to wait till we die to be happy? What's that all about? But here's the interesting thing. In all the accountings of her life, people kept saying that she had this very sweet, very low-key, but cheerful disposition. It's not like she didn't want anything. She had had a dream of moving into the spiritual life. That dream was granted. And from there, she lived in such a state of gratitude. Gratitude for what she had. She had a purpose, which was to pray for others unceasingly, and that brought her much joy. She got to do what her soul craved for, but unlike many of us who get our dreams realized, she didn't go, well, what's next? What's next? What I realized is, to that simple mind, the idea of not looking for happiness in this world, but in the next, meant she wasn't looking for things to be different in her life, but kept going deeper into her sense of spirituality. She lived in gratitude for what she had. And as we heard so eloquently from Reverend Nadine last week, gratitude increases spiritualism. We're less dependent on the world out there. And in Science of Mind, don't we teach not to look at the world for our good, but to turn to God, the kingdom within us, and when we discover it, which Bernadette did in her own way, she found that sense of spirituality within herself, and as a result, she was not dragged down by the conditions that she was facing. I think she was a great example of what we say, that we are not our human conditions. Human conditions do not define who we are or limit us in any way. Now, I don't know about you. I mean, it's a very sweet story, but I think if I were Bernadette, I don't know that this story would be playing out that way. I don't know that there wouldn't have been some National Enquirer element to it, like, Bernadette declares, "It's unfair. I discovered the water. I should be healed. Where's the lady now?" Bernadette declares, "Discrimination at the convent. I saw the Virgin Mary. No one's promoting me to Mother Superior." Does it sound a little bit like what might happen? So I was thinking about this, and I know I've shared with some of you at my Wednesday night services, but I really felt I had to share with the group at large today how much I personally have experienced the power of rewriting our stories in my relationship with my dad, who passed away last November. So just a little history. My parents separated when I was 10 years old. And at that point, my dad, who was very, very dedicated to his profession as a political scientist teaching at the University of British Columbia, he became a Sunday dad. We didn't hear much from him during the week. We just saw him on Sunday afternoons. And he got more and more dedicated to his work, and he started a new life with my stepmom. And I was always very, very close to my mom, and here I was living with her, and I got to witness her pain and how much she suffered through the divorce. Whereas what I saw from Dad is he didn't seem to suffer much at all. Now, I have to tell you, I didn't have a contentious relationship with him. We were always very civil and all of that. But the story I developed in my head was that while my dad cared about us, he had a sense of responsibility for us, but he certainly didn't love us deeply like many dads love their children. And there were any number of things you might tell me about him, but if you went anywhere near that belief that my dad did not love me, those strings were very tight. And I'll tell you, that story took on National Enquirer proportions of poor Reverend Mark. His father never really loved him. Thankfully, I had a very spiritually evolved mom who, despite all the pain she went through, she was always looking for ways to make good of difficult situations. And over the years, she started telling me, you know, Mark, and she told my siblings as well, remember that your dad grew up in a generation where fathers didn't talk to their children about deep personal things. He had no frame of reference for that. He didn't know. They were the only couple in my whole high school at that time who were divorced. There was no role model out there for him to follow. She said he didn't know. Just because he wasn't there for you the way some other dads have been, it doesn't necessarily mean he didn't love you and love you very deeply. And that began a little bit of the loosening of the strings of my consciousness and willingness to maybe explore that, well, maybe Dad does actually love us. To the point that I started to open up, and when I was going through difficult times, I would share those with him, and he was so moved that I would do that. And that opened things up in our relationship. And I'll tell you, when I came into this teaching in my late 30s, I really upped the ante on my spiritual practice of forgiveness and also looking for the deeper good in everything. And our relationship definitely changed to one of deep caring, which I'm so grateful that we had that for all those last years. You know, the facts didn't change, but the relationship did, to the point that I remember in 2004, after my ordination, when I was dropping him off at the airport, standing there on the sidewalk saying goodbye, him looking at me just with such pride in his eyes and just saying, continue to be the man that you are. Imagine that. And just recently, after he passed away, just recently at the University of British Columbia, they honored his work and everything he had contributed. Now, my dad didn't share much about his work. He didn't brag about his accomplishments, but I was sitting there and I got to hear about these amazing accomplishments. I knew that he had been commissioned to do some service with Henry Kissinger, but what I found out is that Nelson Mandela had reached out to Henry Kissinger to team up with Lord Carrington to put together a mediation team to go to South Africa and help with the Zulu and the National African Congress conflict down there. And my dad was one of 5 people around the world that Henry Kissinger reached out to. I'm going like, and this is the man that never boasted about that, but looked at me like I was the greatest thing on earth toward the end of his life, you know? And hearing his students share about how much he had contributed to their life and realizing, wow, they're talking about him like he was a paternal figure. Like he gave them something. He didn't know how to give it to us in that way, but he gave it to them. God's nature got to be expressed through him in that way. And I'll tell you, if I hadn't been willing to change my story, I would have been there at the university listening to this and going, fine, great. Oh, he did all these wonderful things, but he was never there for us. We were deprived. And instead, Instead, my heart just got opened up so much. I was so filled with love and joy and admiration. Instead of having a negative experience, I got to see the beauty of what love can do when we're willing to turn to love, of how if we don't make assumptions, we might actually learn that others aren't thinking what we think they are. The power of forgiveness in how my parents developed such a lovely relationship toward the end of both their lives. You know, what would I have missed out on, folks, if I hadn't been willing to loosen and cut those strings? So what I'm going to invite us all to consider is when we find ourselves holding on to something that we keep wanting to repeat as something very negative in our lives, ask ourselves, what am I assuming? What am I adamant about that might not be the truth? That in itself starts to open the door to seeing the situation differently and to retelling the story. And also ask, what aspect of God's nature is this experience allowing me to discover in myself? Or did that experience allow me to discover in myself? In what way can I come to know God more deeply through this experience? I say, let's look at those National Enquirer headlines in our heads about I'm a failure, life never goes my way, I'm not worthy, I won't forgive. And let's do with them what we really should do with them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let's pray. As we turn our attention inward, feeling that presence of goodness that is always seeking to know and realize and be itself in us, that every impulse for good in us is the impulse of God's nature, of love, of joy, of abundance, of wholeness, of beauty, of goodness in every way it can be known and realized, just seeking to know and be itself. I know that that presence is the life of each and every one of us. It is ever present in all parts of the universe. And I know as we come together today, looking at this idea of our stories, we now set the intention to be willing to let go of those stories that deny us the experience of God's presence right at the center of our being. Those stories that deny us from seeing the greater good and the potential for good in the world. And as we do, I know we step into greater experiences of God's love and goodness and majesty. I know that we are blessed by coming together as a community, that much healing occurs just by us being together. We bless our church, we bless all churches everywhere, synagogues, temples, mosques, ashrams, all pass to God. And with a full and grateful heart for the goodness that God is always, I just say, thank you, God, thank you, life, thank you, love. And release this word knowing it is done. I let it be, and so it is. And together we say, Amen.